Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the INTP stream. I wanted to discuss in this video an idea that I'd had a while back. And I was kind of rummaging through my mind on the topic of automation and how, as we move into the future, automation will be a major sort of trend. And that many low-skill, low-wage jobs that are simple rather than complex will begin to be automated, and will begin to replace human employees with machines. And I was kind of thinking, would this also, because I was a legal studies major at school, so there was some mention of the fact that, well, maybe in the future we have AI lawyers, and the legal cases decided on precedent are ultimately decided by AI, right? By computers. And I'm not so much discussing AI in this video, more automation, right? So there's the distinction between those two things. And so, not all automation is AI, right? But AI will serve some role in automation, right? And replacing human minds and human decision makers with computational systems that are better able to calculate the most optimal decision in any given case. Now, with regard to this video, I'm going to title it The Democracy Machine, and it's more or less a theoretical sort of thought experiment about government. And if you've watched my previous videos, I'm sort of running in a series about how we might optimize, how into the future we might optimize our systems of government, and not only procedures, but the fundamental representative democracy structure itself, constitutional democracy that we have in the United States. How will we go about, how could we go about optimizing the system if it can't be optimized? I talked about in the previous video how in the States there is this tendency to glorify the logic of the design of the framers of the original Constitution of the United States government after its the breakaway colonies formed their own society from Great Britain at the time. And so there's a lot of glorification of the design of the Constitution and the government in the United States in rhetoric, especially on the right, but also probably on the left as well. There's this concession that the design is impressive in some way, and I don't deny that, but I think that there are various optimizations that can be undertaken, and I'm trying to think about how this government that we have will change into the future. So this is more of a futurism kind of idea, and what I'm specifically wondering about is how automation could even be applied to government, right? Or even entire branches of government. And it's more or less a high-minded theoretical idea in this one. I'm not proposing this as an actual re-engineering solution of any kind, but it's something that I imagined, or an idea that I had that I want to express. So the idea is we have something called the democracy machine. You might also call it the direct democracy machine, where automation applies even to government, specifically Congress in this case. As it currently stands, we have a representative constitutional democracy in the United States, where we elect, especially when it comes to Congress, we elect representatives to make decisions, policy decisions, on our behalf, to both develop legislation and vote upon legislation. But we can almost condense the role of a congressional representative to this binary of roles. They develop legislation, they assess legislation, and, well, that's three, right? But they develop and assess is more or less the same thing. There's assessment as a process, as a part of development. And they also vote upon legislation. But if the purpose of a representative is largely just to vote upon legislation, pieces of legislation, then couldn't that be done by, like, that's a very simple role, right? It's the decision to whether to issue a yes or a no. It's an important decision, but cognitively, it isn't a very complex one. And while I don't think that we can completely automate Congress, I think that we may be able to not automate. We could introduce machine technology and a kind of automation into the process of not so much upon developing legislation, which has to be done at this point with the lack of advanced AI by human representatives, but at least the voting aspect of things. As I said, this isn't so it's only loosely tied to automation. It wouldn't automate anything, but it would introduce technology, new technology, into the process of voting upon pieces of legislation. So what is this democracy machine? What is this direct democracy machine? This theoretical, this thought experiment-y kind of concept that I'm trying to concretize here? Well, if we concede one of the primary roles of our elected representatives, district representatives, congressional district representatives, is to simply vote, issue a yes or no, an affirmative or a negation upon new pieces of legislation. Notwithstanding, they do have a role in developing and assessing legislation as well, right? But let's focus now just on the congressional representative's role in voting, issuing a yes or a no upon new pieces of legislation. Well, so this thing that I've conceived of is I call the democracy machine, right? It may as well be some sort of new sort of imagineering effort in political science, where instead of having our congressional representatives vote on our behalf on new pieces of legislation, on the district's behalf, you actually have the district itself, right? Or at least the district itself voting upon whatever piece of legislation is at issue, right? So the way that this democracy machine would work is you'd have some sort of computerized system where new pieces of legislation are introduced to the floor for vote. As a part of that process, district residents are informed of the new piece of legislation that they are to vote upon. And essentially what would happen is we would have the district vote. We would have a district vote issuing, right, either an affirmative or a negation on the piece of legislation per the judgment of the district, per the democratic judgment of the district. And so then we simply calculate whether yes or no, the affirmative or the negation, gets the majority of the votes, right? In a plurality system of just simply taking the majority of the voters that turn out. And whether yes or no, whether the affirmative or the negation gets the majority of the district's votes, then either per a calculation of whether the affirmative or the negation gets the majority of the votes of those that turn out, the machine then renders, or the computer then renders, an answer on behalf of the district, right? Having taken account of whether the affirmative or the negation gets the majority of the votes, the computer renders the affirmative or the negation on the vote. The only difference would be that the district itself would be voting upon the pieces of legislation, and a calculation of whether the affirmative or the negation gets the majority of the votes would simply cause, as a part of a computerized process, then the district renders its vote, right, through this technological medium, right, through this computerized majority tabulation system that would then replace the human decision maker, right, the congressional the congressional representative that now issues the votes on behalf of the district, right? And so essentially this could be called the direct democracy machine, or just the democracy machine. And in a previous video I talked about the fact that representative democracy isn't really democracy. especially in a large country like ours, because you can't have one. You can't say that one person can represent 100,000, right? So whether the representative on behalf of the district issues either the affirmative or the negation, right? It is one vote, right, deciding whether that district affirms or negates. In this system, it would be much more votes that would decide whether the district affirms or negates, right? Many, many more people from the district, not just one, right? Many, many more people from the district will be rendering a yes or a no, or voting upon an affirmative or a negation, and rendering over the affirmative or the negation for the district itself. So, is it not better? Is it not, if our goal is democracy, is it not better for whether a district votes affirmative or negationary? Is it not better for us to determine whether the district votes, whether it affirms or negates, based on the greatest number of votes possible, rather than just one, right? I think so. And I think that a machine like this, some sort of automated Congress, right, some sort of system like this, a simple system to conceive of logistically, could easily be developed. It's not some sort of advanced computer technology that I'm reconceiving here. More or less, simply introducing technology into government and technologizing government, if you will. I think it's very interesting. And I think it would make the system overall more democratic. It would make it more of a direct democracy. It wouldn't be a perfect direct democracy because you'd still have majority rule, right? Majority rule, does negate democracy in some sense because the majority decides and imposes its will upon the minority. Regardless, it gets us closer. And democracy is an ideal that we never actually can achieve logistically, but we can move as close to it as possible, right? If we introduce the right measures and systems and whatnot. It's just an interesting idea. Again, so it's called the democracy machine. And I would encourage, I would love to hear what other people are thinking about this. Or would think about this, because it's more or less a concept I haven't heard before. But that's the basic idea. And of course, now here's the thing. It wouldn't actually replace the need for human decision makers in Congress, right? We would still have to have districts electing representatives. Why, right? Well, because voting is not all that representatives need to do. They also need to develop legislation in coordination with lobbyists. And we have to have committees that assess the validity of legislation. And all of that is a very important part of the process. But at least when it comes to voting, right? At least when it comes to the final vote in issuing an affirmative or a negation, right? I think that that's better off in the hands of the people rather than a people's representative that can defect or act independently or do whatever. And there are objections to this. I presented this to numerous friends, or a couple of friends rather, and good ones have been raised. I'm not going to introduce any of those in this video because I want to keep it short. The main one is a good friend of mine raises the point that representatives are informed, people are not, right? Would we rather have an informed one vote upon a piece of legislation rather than an uninformed many? I think that's not a very good argument, because I think it's a good objection. I think it's a very honest objection, but I don't think it actually defeats the proposal in any way. And that's mostly because, is one informed, right? What would inevitably happen with this system is, instead of one informed person voting, you'd have multiple informed people voting. That's a logistical consequence of the system I'm proposing here. And so there's no more to it than that. Under his system of maintaining this direct representative democracy Congress we have, well, you just simply have one informed person voting to decide whether the district affirms or negates a piece of legislation. In my system, you'd inevitably have many, many multiples more of informed people voting on the piece of legislation. That's better than one, right? 2 heads better than 1, 3 heads better than 2, 4 heads better than 3, and that's why democracy seems to work, right? So it's just an idea. It wouldn't replace the need for human decision makers and electing representatives, but they would have a different role. They wouldn't have necessarily a voting role. They wouldn't have a final decision-making power. They would simply have the ability to work with lobbyists, to sit on committees, to develop pieces of legislation. And I think that's logistically very achievable. But I think when it comes to whether a district finally decides whether it affirms or negates any new legislative act, I think that belongs to the people rather than the people's representative. And I think that's just that it all depends on how much you value democracy. It really all depends on that. I think this system would encourage more participation, would generate more turnout in other elections, rather than just the congressional elections. I think it would make for a more active populace, a more active democracy, by creating a direct democracy valve, if you will. I've talked about another way of doing that in a previous video, but at least in this one, I think it's more simpler. So let me know what you think about it. I'd love to get comments, and get more feedback on the idea. I know the objection as to whether representatives are inherently more informed. I take that objection, but I think that under this system, inevitably, it would actually lead to the inevitable result. It would lead to multiple individuals being informed, voting, affirming, or negating, in the form of this, plurality majority, plurality majority calculation of what gets whether the affirmative or the negation gets the majority of the votes of the voters that turn out. I think that inevitably leads to a system where we have more informed people rather than just one representative deciding, and it ultimately leaves that decision-making power to the people, acting through this technologized aspect of government, rather than a single representative, rather than just an elected representative that can defect, can be incompetent, can be corrupt, can be insulated as the result of being up in Washington rather than in their districts themselves. I think it simply it changes the dynamic. It changes the dynamic of the power that the people have to decide democratically what passes and what don't in Congress. So hopefully you enjoy this idea. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I have anything more to say about it, or if it would connect back to any other. I don't think so. I think that's it. All right, guys. Thank you for watching, and like and subscribe. Thanks.